In the dark silence of the night, a man finds himself plunged into a deep abyss of restlessness. His name, buried beneath the shadows of his own obsession, no longer matters. What does matter are the visions that have tormented him since his mind began to wander beyond the boundaries of reality. An echo of whispers calls to him from deep within, urging him to seek a truth that perhaps should remain hidden. For months now, he has been visited by a recurring dream, a vivid vision of a city that has never existed on maps, a nameless place that slips through the cracks of sanity. In his dreams, the streets of the city stretch out like dark tentacles, and buildings of impossible architecture rise up towards a sky that seems to vibrate with a palpable energy. The protagonist feels that this place calls him, attracts him with a hypnotic force that he cannot resist. As the days pass and the line between waking and sleeping blurs, his mind is flooded with images that haunt and terrify him in equal measure. With each passing night, the visions become more intense, more intrusive. He hears whispering voices that promise him revelations and secrets, but also warn him of the dangers lurking in the shadows. Yet human curiosity is a powerful impulse, and our protagonist cannot help but become fascinated by the mystery of the Nameless City. What secrets does it hold? What horrors and wonders lie hidden behind its walls? The question consumes him, and the search for answers becomes his only reason for being. At first, his attempts to investigate the city are thwarted by a lack of information. Ancient, dusty books tell of unexplored places and forgotten legends, but he never specifically mentions the city that inhabits his dreams. Those around him look upon him with concern and bewilderment, regarding his obsession as a manifestation of madness. But he is convinced that the city is real, that its existence is rooted in some corner of human history, waiting to be discovered. Finally, after a whirlwind of thoughts, decisions, and anguish, he makes the determination to undertake the journey that will take him to the city. He says goodbye to his home, leaving behind the comforts of everyday life, determined to confront the unknown. In his heart, he carries the mixture of excitement and fear, the hope of discovering the truth behind his visions and the dread of what he might find along the way. So he sets out, crossing desolate landscapes and inhospitable terrain, guided only by his instinct and the images that torment him. As he ventures deeper into the vast unknown, he senses the city approaching, as if lurking, waiting for him to come close enough to reveal itself in all its terrible glory. During the journey, the nights become an endless cycle of sleepless nights, and the days transform into a spiral of exhaustion and anxiety. He meets strangers on his way, whose faces reflect the same madness he has been harboring. Some try to warn him about the futility of his quest, while others, with dull eyes, seem to have been in his place, caught in the same web of despair. As he moves forward, the feeling that something is following him becomes almost palpable. Sometimes, as he turns a corner or crosses a lonely path, he feels the presence of shadows slipping around him. Yet he does not stop. The Nameless City calls to him with a force he cannot ignore. Arriving at a small town, a place forgotten by time, he stops to rest. Here, the locals seem to be accustomed to the shadow that envelopes the city, and their gazes are a testament to the terror lurking nearby. With each tale he hears of the fates of those who dared enter, fear begins to creep into his mind. But through it all, the resolve to press on remains firm in his heart. Finally, beneath the fading moonlight, the protagonist finds himself standing on the border between the known world and the darkness that awaits him. With one last sigh of doubt, he steps across the threshold, leaving reality behind and entering the mysteries of the Nameless City. The true horror of his quest is only just beginning, and as the shadows close in around him, he is simultaneously captivated and terrified by what he is about to discover. The morning he decided to leave, the sky was covered with heavy clouds that seemed to mourn the absence of his resolution. The cold breeze caressed his face as he crossed the threshold of his home, and a chill ran down his spine, as if the place itself was warning him of the fate that awaited him. However, anxiety was mixed with an indescribable emotion. He was ready to face the unknown. As he moved away, the familiarity of his surroundings slowly faded, becoming an increasingly strange and desolate landscape. The paths he once knew well began to twist and blur, as if they were trying to confuse him and lead him in unwanted directions. All around him, nature seemed to watch him with invisible eyes, and every creak of branches or whisper of the wind seemed to carry with it a warning message. The journey became long and arduous. Hours turned into days, and days faded away in a spiral of indeterminate time. Each stop became an opportunity to reflect on his dreams and the city that had drawn him so insistently. During the first few nights, he stayed in humble inns, where the murmurs of the locals often revolve around the city he was so enthralled by. Yet when he listened to them, a disquiet began to creep in, as his tired eyes revealed a mixture of fear and respect. At one of these inns, he heard an old man tell stories about the Nameless City. His words were imbued with palpable fear, and his trembling voice was an echo of the warnings others had whispered to him. "It is a cursed place," he said, "where forgotten gods still walk among the shadows. Those who enter rarely return. Their souls are trapped, and their bodies become mere echoes of what they once were." The protagonist felt a chill upon hearing these words, but also a deep fascination. What dark secrets were hidden in this city? What unspeakable truths were within his grasp? Thus he continued his journey, going deeper and deeper into uncharted lands, where the landscape became more inhospitable and desolate. The mountains rose imposingly around him, their peaks covered in mist, as if trying to protect something valuable that lay hidden in the valley. Looking up, the protagonist noticed how the clouds gathered ominously, darkening the horizon even more, and a disturbing feeling took hold of him. It was as if nature itself was against him, trying to dissuade him from continuing. One night, while camping under a starry sky that seemed to watch him with ancient eyes, he began to experience even more vivid dreams. In his visions, the city appeared before him with terrifying clarity, its cobblestone streets glowing with a dim light, surrounded by buildings with impossible shapes. In the heart of the city, a massive monolith stood, covered in inscriptions in forgotten languages. The voices that had been calling to him whispered louder, urging him to come closer to that shadowy image that seemed to be the beating heart of the city. Sleepless nights became a reality, and with each passing day, his determination grew. However, so did his anxiety, and the shadows in the forest seemed to move with a purpose of their own. Often, he would stop and look back, sensing something following him, a lurking presence lurking in the darkness. When he stopped to rest, the air would grow thick, and the silence would become a burden, as if the world around him held its breath, awaiting the outcome of his quest. After weeks of traveling, he came to a crossroads where the road split in two. One of the paths seemed to fade into the fog, while the other stretched into a darker, denser forest. Although his instinct told him to continue down the more illuminated path, his heart urged him to venture into the darkness, where he felt the Nameless City was waiting for him. With his pulse racing and a mix of fear and anticipation, he made the decision to follow the path less traveled. With each step he took on the dark path, the atmosphere grew heavier and heavier. The air was filled with strange smells, and the sound of his own footsteps resonated like a distant echo. He soon realized that he was no longer alone. As he moved forward, elongated shadows seemed to move in the periphery of his vision, always on the edge of the light, as if trying to avoid being seen. His heart was pounding, but curiosity drove him forward. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he emerged from the thick forest and was faced with a breathtaking sight. From the top of a hill, he saw the Nameless City. Its walls, worn by time, rose in the distance, and an oppressive silence enveloped the place. In that instant, the protagonist felt that his previous life was behind him, that he was on the edge of an abyss from which he could not return. The city called to him, ethereal whispers promising revelations and mysteries beyond his understanding. As he descended towards the city, a feeling of inevitability invaded him. With each step, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, as if they were reaching out to him, wanting to absorb him into their darkness. And so, amidst a mixture of terror and wonder, the protagonist crossed the threshold into the Nameless City, where the unknown awaited him with open arms. As he crossed the threshold that marked the border between the known world and the Nameless City, the protagonist felt an invisible weight settle on his shoulders. The atmosphere was thick, almost palpable, and a deathly silence enveloped him like a dark cloak. With each step he took, the echo of his own movements resonated in the air, creating a cacophony of loneliness that reverberated in his mind. Shadows danced around him, slipping through the corners of the city as if they were living entities, waiting for him to delve deeper into their realm of darkness. The city unfolded before him like a labyrinth of wonders and horrors. The streets were paved with uneven stones, worn by time and decay. The buildings, with their impossible shapes and disturbing designs, rose towards the sky like sleeping monsters. They were structures that defied the laws of architecture, with sharp angles and surfaces that seemed to twist in a kind of macabre dance. The facades were covered in moss and vines, as if nature was reclaiming its territory, and the city was a forgotten testimony of a time that no longer existed. As the protagonist advanced, the feeling of being watched became more and more intense. The windows of the buildings resembled dead eyes, and he could not help but imagine that behind each glass there was someone, waiting impatiently. A disturbing combination of curiosity and fear intertwined in his chest, leading him to explore the darkest corners of the city. As he walked, he began to notice disturbing details. The inscriptions carved into the walls were cryptic, written in a language he could not understand, but which evoked a sense of the sacred and the forbidden. Some of them seemed like warnings, while others promised hidden knowledge. A shiver ran down his spine as he considered what it might mean to delve into these secrets. Despite his fear, a part of him longed to discover what these inscriptions had to offer. On his way, he came across a desolate market. The tables, covered in dust and cobwebs, were empty, as if they had been abandoned overnight. Yet, he couldn't help but feel that there had been life here once. The shadows moving between the streets seemed to recall the echoes of laughter, shouts, and the bustle of everyday life. The protagonist stopped in a corner, listening intently, trying to catch any hint of activity, but all he could hear was the soft murmur of the wind passing between the buildings, carrying with it the breath of the past. As he continued his exploration, a subtle change in the air made him pause. A cold sweat ran down his forehead as he noticed the atmosphere growing heavier. It was as if the city was breathing, inhaling and exhaling in a rhythm of its own, full of life and death at the same time. The silence became deafening, and the protagonist felt that every fiber of his being was on alert. Something was about to happen, something that would make him confront the true horror of the city. It was then that, as he turned a corner, he came across a figure. A shadow was projected against the wall, a hooded figure that seemed to emerge from the darkness itself. His face was hidden, but his eyes, two bright flashes in the gloom, watched him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. The protagonist felt a chill run through his body, but he could not help but approach. There was something about that figure that attracted him, an inexplicable magnetism that urged him to discover more. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice echoing in the solitude. The figure remained silent for what seemed like an eternity, as if deliberating on the answer. Finally, it moved, taking a step forward, revealing a face marked by shadows. In a voice that rang like a distant echo, it spoke. "I am a traveler, like you, trapped within the shadows of this city. I have come to understand its secrets and its horrors." The protagonist felt a shudder. The thought that another human being had walked those same streets offered momentary comfort, but the warning in the traveler's voice filled him with unease. "What do you know of the city?" he asked, eager for answers. The hooded figure laughed softly, a sound that echoed like a lament. "The city is a place of forbidden knowledge. Those who seek answers often find more than they bargained for. What you see is only a fraction of its true self. As the traveler's words penetrated his mind, the protagonist felt anxiety begin to creep in again. Curiosity had brought him here, but now he understood that there was a thin line between knowledge and madness. The Nameless City was a labyrinth of illusions, and he found himself at the center of a trap that could cost him his sanity. "You must be careful, traveler," the figure continued. "Not all that shines is light, and not all paths lead to salvation. Some will take you deep into the darkness, where reason crumbles and madness takes shape." The protagonist felt a pang of terror. The warning echoed in his mind as he looked out at the city around him, filled with shadows and echoes of the unknown. The figure, noticing his distress, bowed its head slightly. "If you choose to go forward, remember that the secrets of this city can consume your soul. Do not be seduced by its promises of power and knowledge, for they often come at a terrible price." With those words, the traveler vanished into the darkness, leaving the protagonist alone once again in the overwhelming silence of the Nameless City. His heart pounded, and a knot of uncertainty formed in his stomach. Should he continue his search, or turn back before it was too late? Knowing that he could not turn back, the protagonist decided to move forward, although a shadow of doubt loomed over him. The city had caught him in its spell, and each step he took brought him closer to the horrors that lurked in the gloom. As he ventured deeper into the unknown, a mix of fascination and terror accompanied him, and he knew there was no turning back. The Nameless City had claimed him, and his fate was sealed in the shadows that loomed over him. As the protagonist ventured deeper into the Nameless City, the feeling of unease became more palpable. Shadows seemed to lengthen, twisting and moving in ways that defied logic. The atmosphere was oppressive, as if the city itself was alive, breathing and pulsing with a dark, unknown purpose. With each step, his heart pounded, pulsing to the rhythm of his deepest fears. As he explored a labyrinth of alleys, he noticed the inscriptions on the walls growing more abundant and complex. Some symbols seemed to dance in the dim light of his lamp, inviting him to decipher their hidden meanings. He stopped in front of a wall covered in ancient runes, each one vibrating with an inexplicable power. His fingers ran over the inscriptions, feeling an energy that made his skin crawl. It was as if the words were whispering to him secrets lost in time, secrets that many had sought and few had understood. It was then that a wave of visions hit him, bringing him into a semi-trance state. In his mind, chaotic images emerged, showing him a landscape of horror and despair. He saw figures wandering the streets, faces distorted by terror and madness. Some seemed to be caught in a frenzied dance, moving aimlessly, while others lay motionless on the ground, as if they had been consumed by the city itself. The air was permeated with a silent scream, a mixture of suffering and longing that echoed in every corner of that cursed place. He woke from his trance with a start, sweat beading on his forehead. The vision had been too real, too heartbreaking. He understood that the city held a sinister secret. It was not only a forgotten place, but a receptacle of lost souls, a mirror of the nightmares of those who dared to cross its doors. He felt a growing urge to unravel the truth behind these visions, although a part of him doubted whether he really wanted to know the horror that was hidden in the gloom. Continuing his journey, he came across a building that seemed more imposing than the others. Its walls were made of black stone, covered in moss, and its door, adorned with grotesque figures, seemed to invite him in. With his heart pounding, he approached, feeling something inside him telling him that there he would find answers, but also that he could find his doom. As he crossed the threshold, he was greeted by a freezing air that made him shiver. The interior of the building was vast and desolate, lit by a dim light that seemed to seep through cracks in the walls. Looking around, he discovered a series of statues carved from stone, each depicting a monstrous being, their faces twisted into expressions of agony and madness. The statues were arranged in a circle, as if they were participating in a macabre ritual, watching him with empty eyes. In the center of the hall, an altar stood, covered in a dusty cloth. The protagonist approached it, feeling a mix of fear and attraction. Uncovering the altar, he revealed an ancient grimoire, its pages yellowed and worn. With trembling hands, he began to turn the pages, eyes scanning the text that spoke of dark rituals and cosmic entities. The ink glowed with a strange radiance, and the protagonist felt himself drawn into the depths of knowledge that defied logic and reason. Words began to come to life in his mind, revealing to him stories of ancient beings that once ruled the land. They spoke of cults that worshipped forgotten gods, of sacrifices made in honor of entities that existed beyond human understanding. Horror gripped his heart as he realized that those who had come before him had been on a similar quest, eager to know the truth, but doomed to become lost in madness. What terrified him most, however, was the mention of one being in particular, one that ruled the Nameless City. It was said to be a god of darkness, a being that fed on despair and suffering, and that manifested itself in the form of shadows that danced in the darkness. The text warned that those who looked directly into its essence would go mad, trapped in an eternal cycle of torment. The protagonist slammed the book shut, his mind in a storm of thoughts and emotions. He realized that his quest had taken a dark turn, and that what had begun as an adventure of discovery had transformed into a fight for his own sanity. The Nameless City had not only lured him with promises of knowledge, but had also trapped him in a deadly game where the stakes were his sanity and his life. As terror gripped him, movement in the corner of the room caught his attention. He turned quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. Before him, a figure emerged from the shadows, so inhuman in appearance that he could hardly bear to look at it. It was a being of amorphous shapes, with tentacles that extended and contracted as if darkness itself had taken form. Its eyes shone with an unnatural glow, and a voice echoing in his mind invaded him. "You have come to my abode, seeker of truths. What is it that you truly long for?" The voice was a whisper and a scream at once, a mix of melody and agony. The protagonist felt his mind reeling at the being's presence, the reality around him beginning to fade away. Despite the terror that gripped him, a part of him was fascinated by the creature, as if he were being drawn into an unfathomable abyss. "I seek answers," he replied, his voice shaky but determined. "I want to know what this city is and what it hides." The creature smiled, a distorted grimace revealing razor-sharp teeth. "Answers come with a price, mortal. The truth can set you free, but it can also destroy you. Are you willing to risk it all?" At that moment, the protagonist understood that he had crossed an irreparable line. The Nameless City was not just a place of discovery. It was a labyrinth of horrors into which he had fallen headlong. In his quest for knowledge, he had awakened a being of terrifying dimensions, and now he had to face the consequences of his curiosity. The creature took a step forward, and the air was filled with a smell of decay and despair. The protagonist, caught between the desire to know the truth and the terror of the unknown, felt lost in a sea of confusion. As the shadow of the being rose above him, he knew that his life would never be the same. The Nameless City had revealed its horror, and now it called him to participate in its dark game. The air in the Nameless City grew heavier and heavier, a palpable pressure settling on the protagonist's shoulders like a stone slab. As the dark figure rose before him, a mixture of terror and fascination invaded him. The being's presence was so overwhelming that his senses began to blur. The boundaries of reality faded in a whirlwind of fear and unease. "Are you willing to risk it all?" the creature whispered, its voice echoing in his mind like a distant echo. The protagonist, feeling his sanity hanging by a thread, hesitated. The curiosity that had brought him to this place was being consumed by growing anxiety. What truth could be so powerful that it would justify the risk of losing his sanity? However, the desire to know the hidden secrets of the city was stronger than his fear. "Yes," he answered, his voice shaky but firm. "I want to know." The creature smiled, a grimace of triumph that left the protagonist feeling exposed, vulnerable. The being extended a tentacle towards him, and in that instant, a wave of visions began to invade his mind. He collapsed under the weight of alien memories, scenes of terror and suffering that flashed by at breakneck speed. He saw worlds in flames, oceans of madness, and the shadow of ancient gods writhing in their eternal sleep. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Your support means a lot and motivates me to keep creating more interesting content. Also, if you're not subscribed yet, join our community so you don't miss out on anything. Thanks for your support. Each vision was a thread that wove itself into his own psyche, as if the creature were unwinding a ball of terror that had always been hidden within him. The faces of those who had been consumed by the city appeared and disappeared, their eyes reflecting a despair that paralyzed him. He realized that he was not just seeing his visions. He was feeling their pain, their anguish, as if his own soul were being torn apart. He found himself standing in the center of a macabre scene, surrounded by shadows that danced around him. The echo of maniacal laughter rang in his ears, and the air was permeated with a stench of putrefaction. He could see figures wandering in the gloom, trapped in an endless cycle of madness. Those who had once been normal men and women had now become shadows of themselves, their faces distorted by horror. One of the figures approached him, and in an instant, the protagonist recognized an old acquaintance. His heart stopped at the look of despair on his face, a friend who had disappeared years ago. The figure pleaded with him, its trembling lips mouthing words he could not understand, but the terror in its eyes was clear. He was trapped in the city, a victim of his own curiosity. "Help me," the figure cried, its voice echoing in the darkness. The protagonist felt his mind reeling, overwhelmed by the sight of his lost friend. How had he gotten to this place? What fate awaited him? The emotional connection hit him hard, and in that moment, he understood that the Nameless City was not just a place. It was a symbol of human despair, an abyss into which all could fall if they were not careful. The dark creature writhed around him, feeding on his anguish, and in a moment of clarity, the protagonist realized that he must escape. However, as he tried to flee, the shadows closed around him, trapping him in their cold, damp embrace. Madness called to him, whispering promises of forbidden revelations and dark knowledge, but he knew that would only lead to his doom. Finally, with a monumental effort, he managed to break the creature's spell. The scenery faded, and he found himself back in the dark hall of the building where he had found the grimoire. Yet something had changed in him. The echo of the vision still resonated in his mind, and his perception of reality had become distorted. The walls seemed to move closer and further away, as if the city itself was toying with his sanity. As he staggered towards the exit, the protagonist felt madness lurking around every corner. The voices in his head grew in intensity, each one demanding his attention, each one dragging him deeper into abyss. The city was alive, and each step he took pushed him closer to his doom. He ventured back into the deserted streets, feeling the darkness envelop him. The shadows now seemed to come to life, moving with sinister purpose, as if they knew of his mental fragility. The silence became deafening, and echoes of distant laughter resonated in his mind, each one a reminder of what he had seen and felt. The pressure was mounting, and as time slipped through his fingers, the protagonist felt his sanity begin to crumble. Each corner he turned revealed more shadows and more unanswered questions. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if the city itself was assessing his will to survive. As he moved forward, he glimpsed more figures trapped in their own madness, beings who had lost their way in this labyrinth of horror. He could hear their whispers, their wails, and every time one of them turned toward him, a shiver of terror passed through him. The abyss called to him, and he didn't know how long he could withstand the pressure. In a moment of desperation, the protagonist stopped in the middle of the street and screamed, defying the city and the shadows around him. "They won't take me. I won't give up." His voice echoed through the night, and for a brief instant, the shadows stopped. But the answer came not in the form of release, but an ominous echo that filtered through the darkness. "Madness is inevitable," the voices whispered. "They will all fall into the abyss. With a cold sweat running down his brow, the protagonist realized that the city wasn't just testing him, it was absorbing him. In his search for the truth, he had unleashed forces that now threatened to consume him. Madness, that fate he had feared, was fast approaching. As he continued on his way, he felt himself becoming more and more caught in a web of horror. Reality twisted around him, and shadows rose against him, an unstoppable tide dragging him down into the abyss of madness. The Nameless City had claimed his mind, and as he fell deeper into its trap, he understood that escaping its dark embrace might be the most difficult task of all. Despair had become a constant companion for the protagonist. As he delved deeper into the Nameless City, his perception of reality had become alarmingly distorted. Shadows danced around him, dark whispers and distant echoes echoing in his mind, dragging him into an abyss of madness that seemed to have no end. Every step he took felt like a deeper descent into a nightmare without awakening. The air was permeated with an almost tangible heaviness, and as he moved through the deserted streets, a sense of inevitability overwhelmed him. The city seemed to have come to life, pulsating with a dark energy that resonated in every brick and every shadow. The time had come to confront that which lurked in the gloom, the truth he had been searching for, even though he knew it could cost him his own sanity. As he moved forward, he felt something following him, a dark presence that separated itself from the shadows. He turned several times, but found only an eerie silence that enveloped him like an icy embrace. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if the city itself was scanning him, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal its horror. In the midst of his anguish, he recalled the words of the hooded figure he had encountered at the beginning of his adventure. The warning about the price of knowledge echoed in his mind, and his heart pounded. The curiosity that had brought him to this place had been replaced by a visceral fear. Every corner of the city seemed to be woven with the suffering of those who had been there before him. Yet his determination drove him forward. He must face the unknown. At the end of a dark street, he glimpsed a monumental structure rising from the shadows. An ancient, weathered temple, its columns covered in strange inscriptions and symbols. The air around him grew cold, and a shiver ran through his body. He knew this was the place where he would have his final confrontation. With each step he took towards the temple, the silence grew heavier. The stone doors stood ajar, as if inviting him to enter its dark interior. He paused for a moment to inhale deeply, gathering his courage before crossing the threshold. As he entered, he felt as though he had crossed into another world. The atmosphere was thick and charged with energy, as though time had stopped. The interior of the temple was illuminated by a dim light emanating from an altar in the center. Upon the altar, a towering figure stood, its form distorted and twisted, as though it were made of the very shadows that surrounded it. It was a being that defied all logic, with multiple tentacles that twisted and moved with an eerie fluidity. Its presence was overwhelming, and the protagonist felt his mind reel at the magnitude of the horror before him. "Welcome, seeker of truths," the creature said, its voice echoing through the chamber like distant thunder. "You have come far, but the path you have chosen comes with a price." The protagonist felt the ground shake beneath his feet. That voice, deep and ever-present, filled the space with a terrifying echo. It was the same voice he had heard in his dreams, the murmur that had called him to the city. The creature moved forward, its tentacles reaching out towards him, and the protagonist felt an overwhelming force envelop him, trapping him in an embrace of terror. "What do you want from me?" it asked, its voice trembling but filled with renewed determination. "You wish to know the truth, but truth is a dangerous concept," the being replied, moving even closer. In the pursuit of knowledge, many have lost their way and fallen into madness. What I offer is not just knowledge. It is a revelation that can consume your soul. The protagonist felt his heart pound, and a wave of memories hit him. He remembered his lost friend, the visions of despair and madness, and realized he had crossed a line he could not undo. But his curiosity, that innate drive that had guided him, kept him in place. "Give me the truth," he said, his words echoing in the gloom. "I want to know what lies hidden in this city." The being paused, and for a brief moment, the chamber was filled with absolute silence. Then, laughter echoed, a deep sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. "Very well," the creature said, its voice brimming with dark power. "But remember, once you cross the threshold of knowledge, there is no turning back. The truth will change you forever." With a movement of its tentacles, the being began to conjure visions that unfolded in the air before the protagonist. Each image was a fragment of an alternate world, a universe where the limits of reality were malleable and where the impossible came to life. He saw cities in ruins, colossal structures rising into a burning sky, and creatures that defied logic, existing in a perpetual state of horror. The protagonist felt his mind twist at the magnitude of what he was witnessing. The images were so vivid that he could feel the chill of the wind whipping through those desolate landscapes. The vision of an alternate reality began to overflow his consciousness, invading his being with a torrent of sensations and emotions. However, as the visions intensified, so did the suffering. The screams of those caught in madness echoed in his mind, and he realized that each of those visions was a reflection of human pain. He understood that truth was not only knowledge, but a burden that he had to carry with him. Madness was the price paid for peering into the abyss. As reality began to fade, the creature came ever closer, its distorted form merging with the shadows surrounding him. "You are fortunate, traveler," it whispered. "Few have the courage to seek the truth. But remember, what you have seen will be with you forever. Madness is a loyal companion, and those who choose it are never alone." With those words echoing through his mind, the protagonist felt his sanity begin to crumble. The vision slowly faded, leaving him with an overwhelming emptiness. When he was finally able to focus his gaze, the creature had disappeared, and he found himself standing on the empty altar, surrounded by the shadows of the temple. Reality came rushing back, but not as he had left it. His mind was filled with echoes of madness, and the realization that he had crossed a threshold from which he could not return assailed him. The Nameless City had claimed him, and now he was not only a seeker of truths, but a bearer of secrets that could consume him completely. As he walked out of the temple, he felt the pressure on his mind intensify. Shadows twisted around him, and echoes of visions still resonated within him. The city had left its mark on him, and he knew his journey was only just beginning. He was not only facing the horrors that dwelled within, but also the struggle to maintain his humanity in a place where madness was the order of the day. With his heart in his throat, he entered the dark streets again, feeling each step take him further from reason. Truth was a gift and a curse, and now he was caught in the web of the Nameless City, where the unknown awaited him around every corner. The confrontation had left scars on his soul, and as the creature's echo resonated in his mind, he knew his fate was sealed. As the protagonist left the temple, a sense of despair washed over him. The revelations he had witnessed had left a mark on him, and the echoes of truth followed him, ringing in his mind like a siren song. The Nameless City, with its vast web of shadows and whispers, had claimed him, and now he felt more lost than ever. Every step he took echoed like a drum in his chest, a reminder that he was trapped in a labyrinth from which there was no way to escape. The streets were empty, but a palpable tension filled the air. Shadows seemed to come to life, slithering around him, and the protagonist felt madness lurking around every corner. He was no longer just fighting the despair of the city. He now carried with him the weight of the truths he had unearthed. The struggle to maintain his sanity became an increasingly overwhelming challenge. As he moved forward, he recalled the visions he had witnessed in the temple, the burning cities, the screams of those caught in madness, the creature that had warned him of the price of knowledge. It all wove together in his mind, a whirlwind of images that dragged him into an abyss of despair. He wondered if he could ever be free of the burden he now carried, of the truths that had consumed him. The city felt alive, whispering secrets to him in a language only she could understand. The inscriptions on the walls seemed to move, to pulse as if they had a life of their own. Each step brought him closer to darkness, and despite his desire to flee, he found himself unable to do so. Curiosity, that impulse that had brought him here, still burned within him, a spark of longing to understand what lay hidden in the shadows. As he turned a corner, he found himself facing a group of figures. They were the inhabitants of the city, those who had fallen under the spell of madness. Their eyes, empty and lost, stared at him with a mixture of despair and resignation. He realized that they were not just shadows. They were souls trapped in an eternal cycle of suffering, and their faces reflected the horror he had witnessed himself. "Have you come to free our souls?" one of the figures asked, its voice raspy and broken, as if it had been screaming in the darkness for centuries. The protagonist felt a lump in his throat. He couldn't free them. He was as trapped as they were. Yet there was something in their gaze that urged him to try, to find a way to break the cycle of madness that held them captive. He knew the city had played with their minds, had fed their fears and desires until they were shadows of what they once were. "I will try," he replied, his voice echoing in the silence. "I don't know how, but I will try to find a way." As the words left his mouth, a flash of hope lit up the faces of those around him. For a brief instant, the madness seemed to give way to the possibility of release, and the shadows that enveloped them seemed to recede. Yet the protagonist knew the fight was far from over. With renewed determination, he began to explore deeper into the city. He dove into the shadows, searching for answers, trying to unravel the secrets that had held those who had come before him captive. The echoes of his quest guided him, and though fear lurked around every corner, hope shone a faint glow within him. Hours, or perhaps days, passed as he explored the dark corners of the city. He discovered ancient rituals and forgotten objects that seemed to resonate with a strange energy. The history of the city unfolded before him, a history filled with cults and sacrifices of ancient beings who had claimed the city as their home. Each discovery was a piece of the puzzle, and though he felt overwhelmed, the urgency to free the trapped souls drove him forward. Eventually, he came to a monumental hall, its walls covered in inscriptions that glowed with a faint light. In the center, an ancient altar stood, surrounded by carved figures depicting beings from other dimensions. He realized that this was the heart of the city, the place where the rituals that kept the trapped souls were carried out. The protagonist approached the altar, feeling an energy vibrating in the air. With each step, the voice of the city echoed in his mind, whispering secrets to him that defied logic. Aware that time was running out, he began to recite the inscriptions out loud, feeling the energy flow through him. As the words left his mouth, the shadows surrounding the altar began to move, twisting and convulsing as if they were responding to an ancient power. The energy in the room increased, and the air became thick, filled with a palpable tension. The protagonist felt madness creeping in, but his determination kept him steadfast. The inscriptions echoed in the air, creating a chaotic melody that filled the room. With each word he spoke, the carved figures began to come to life, their eyes glowing with an ancient light. The protagonist felt a deep connection with them, as if they shared a common destiny. Suddenly, a rumble shook the temple, and the city seemed to tremble. Shadows swirled in a whirlwind of despair, and the protagonist knew he was close to freeing the trapped souls. With one last cry, he recited the final words of the ritual, and a wave of energy swept through him. Light filled the room, dazzling him, and in an instant, he felt as if he were floating in a sea of pure energy. Trapped souls began to emerge from the shadows, their faces illuminated by the light. With tears in his eyes, the protagonist watched as the madness faded away, replaced by hope and liberation. The cries of despair turned to laughter of joy, and the nameless city began to fade away. The shadows that had tormented its inhabitants dissolved, and the pressure in the air eased. The protagonist felt a lightness in his heart, as if an immense weight had been lifted. Yet in the midst of liberation, one last whisper from the city reached his ears, a warning that echoed in his mind. Madness is never forgotten. The truth is always lurking. With those words echoing in his mind, the protagonist realized that although he had freed the trapped souls, the mark of the city would always remain with him. The truth he had unearthed had changed him forever, and although he had found hope in liberation, the cost had been his own innocence. As the souls ascended toward the light, the protagonist felt torn between the joy of having accomplished his mission and the fear of what would come next. The Nameless City had left its mark, and though he had managed to break the chains of madness, the fight to maintain his sanity was only just beginning. In a final act of will, he turned to the shadows that still lingered and shouted, "I will not let madness consume me. I will not be another victim." With those words, the protagonist stepped into the light, leaving the Nameless City behind and carrying with him the weight of the truths he had discovered. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but with hope in his heart, he felt ready to face whatever challenges life had in store for him. The light of day shone brightly, but for the protagonist, clarity was a concept that had lost its meaning. He had left the Nameless City behind, a place where shadows and madness intertwined with reality, but the echo of its horrors still resonated in his mind. As he walked down a desolate path that led him away from that abyss of darkness, each step brought him closer to an uncertain future, but also pushed him to confront the truths he had unearthed. The release of the trapped souls had brought with it a sense of triumph, but also a burden that weighed on his heart. He knew he had done the right thing, that he had fought against the horror and managed to save those who had been damned in madness. However, the cost of that victory was his own sanity, a price he had paid in a place where knowledge and suffering were inextricably linked. As he walked away from the city, his thoughts were lost in a labyrinth of memories. Visions of the ancient beings, the shadows that danced around him, and the warnings of the creature he had encountered in the temple accompanied him like persistent shadows. He wondered if he could ever shake off those images, if the madness that had stalked his steps would follow him wherever he went. The creature's words echoed in his mind like a mantra. Madness is never forgotten. Truth is always lurking. With each echo, he felt the line between reality and madness blurring a little more. What did truth really mean? He had searched the city for answers, faced his worst fears, and seen things that defied human logic. But now, as he walked under the clear sky, the question that tormented him was whether he had truly found the truth or had only scratched the surface of an even deeper abyss. Coming to a clearing, he stopped to catch his breath. He looked out at the landscape around him. Nature seemed oblivious to his suffering, as if life continued on no matter what had happened in the city. The trees stood proud, the birds sang their carefree melodies, and the sun shone with an intensity that almost hurt. But inside, the battle was still far from over. Over time, his mind began to wander about the meaning of his experience. What was knowledge if it did not come with the wisdom to handle it? He had learned that there are truths that should not be revealed, secrets that remain hidden for a reason. Madness was a treacherous companion, a state that could creep over one like a fog, and each day he wondered if he had truly overcome the shadow the city had left on his soul. He sat down on a fallen log, allowing the calm of the surroundings to envelop him. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the fresh air enter his lungs. As he did so, part of him longed to forget, to leave the weight of his experience behind and live in ignorance as before. But another part of him knew he couldn't. The truth he had discovered had become a part of his being. He couldn't simply erase it from his memory. As he reflected on the path he had traveled, he realized he had gained more than just the release of trapped souls. He had learned about the fragility of the human mind, about how curiosity can lead to doom. The pursuit of knowledge, though noble, could be a deadly trap. And his experience in the city had been a brutal reminder of the dangers lurking in the shadows of knowledge. A murmur in the wind brought him out of his thoughts. Opening his eyes, he realized he was not alone. A figure was approaching him, a traveler who seemed to have emerged from the mists of the forest. The man's gaze was deep and wise, as if he too had known the secrets of the Nameless City. As he reached him, the traveler smiled kindly. "There is no place to hide, is there?" the traveler said, his voice ringing with an understanding that resonated within the protagonist's heart. The protagonist nodded, feeling that the traveler's words were imbued with a truth that resonated within him. He had tried to escape his experience, to find refuge in ignorance, but he knew that the truth is never forgotten. He had been there, in the depths of madness, and he could not simply erase it from his being. "You have been there too?" the protagonist asked, his voice barely a whisper. The traveler smiled again, but his eyes were a mirror of sorrow and wisdom. "I have walked dark paths, and I have found truths not meant to be understood." The Nameless City is not just a place, it is a symbol of our own search for meaning. Many have fallen, but few have returned with deep understanding. As they spoke, the protagonist felt a spark of hope begin to ignite within him. Despite the burden of his experience, there was an opportunity to share his story, to warn others of the dangers that lurk in the pursuit of knowledge. Madness might be a constant shadow, but it was also a reminder that he had survived. "What should I do now?" he asked, his voice filled with determination. "You must share your story," the traveler replied. "Use what you have learned to guide others. Truth is not always an easy path, but those who are willing to listen can find light in the darkness." With those words, the protagonist understood that his journey was not over. Though he had left the Nameless City behind, his experience had transformed him. He was now a bearer of truth, and though knowledge came with a price, it also gave him the responsibility to help others avoid the trap of madness. As the traveler faded into the mist of the forest, the protagonist felt renewed. He knew his path would be arduous, that shadows would always follow him, but with each step, he would be carrying with him the weight of truth and hope. The Nameless City had left an indelible mark on his soul, but it had also taught him that light could flourish even in the darkest of places. As he stood up from the fallen trunk, he took one last look at the forest around him, feeling the breeze caress his face. The fight was not over, but he was ready to face whatever came. With truth as his guide, he stepped into the horizon, ready to tell his story and help those still struggling in the darkness. The Nameless City had been a chapter in his life, but his journey was just beginning. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Your support means a lot and motivates me to keep creating more interesting content. Also, if you're not subscribed yet, join our community so you don't miss out on anything. Thanks for your support.